about to go live on YouTube also. I was wondering, I didn't have time to actually check this with someone who knows these things much better than me. Can you go on Facebook Live and YouTube Live at the same time? And apparently you can. If you're having problems, please tell me. And I thought of the advantage of this because I was having a lot of trouble before putting old videos, old or even videos that are already recorded on Facebook Live, to put them onto YouTube. So I figured just put them directly onto YouTube and we'll see how that goes. And if you have any difficulties, please tell me. And of course, you could always send in your questions. We'll try to address the ones for those of us who are here in person and those of us who are joining us online. We're always happy to have good questions, just non-interrupted ones. The first thing I wanted to get to was addressing just an aspect of the recent elections we had here in Israel. Now, I don't believe that the Torah and politics mix. I don't believe that people who are religious leaders should be getting involved in politics. I think there's something really, really wrong with political parties that are basically run by rabbinical figures. Also, other religious figures shouldn't be involved in politics. It's just not the right thing to do. Religious figures should be teaching people about ethics and morality, proper behavior, how to be good citizens. But politics is too dirty, at least the way it's done today. If we actually just have sit down and meet with each other and all that, so perhaps the rabbinical figures should be expressing their opinions. But when we mix Torah and politics, it's already a bad deal. And I thought that in previous elections, we've talked about the aspect that they sometimes bring up, that there is a commandment, so to speak, to have a king. We're supposed to set up a Jewish king, and he's basically the government. He's supposed to run foreign policy. Perhaps recently we were discussing the Abarbanel's opinion. The Abarbanel believed that this whole idea of having a king is a concession to the Yetzer Hara, a concession to the evil inclination. He connects it, for example, to the idea that is the captive woman, which we discussed last week. The captive woman in the war, the man takes her for his own and eventually forces her to marry him, convert to Judaism. If she doesn't, that's really not an option when she's brought into this game. And that was the sages say, a concession to the Yetzer Hara. Maimonides continued and said that even that allowance that existed during certain wars, that's also subject of controversy. There was a time when the Jewish soldiers could technically eat non-kosher food because they happen not to have any kosher food with them. Not that they're starving, but they can enjoy non-kosher food also. That's also a dispensation to the Yetzer Hara. So too, the idea of having a king. And one of the major clues to that in, let's say, the book of Deuteronomy, the only place where it discusses actively the halachas, so to speak, and the mitzvah of a Jewish king, it only describes how the king is limited in his behavior. He cannot have too much wealth. He cannot have too many horses, too many wives, and he's supposed to write himself a Sefer Torah and keep with him all the time another Sefer Torah aside from the one that everybody has to write. He's got to write himself one and keep it with him in order to keep him on the right path. So we haven't heard anything about what the king is supposed to do. And not only that, all the rules we have about what a king's rights are, taxes, etc., what he can demand from the people, that's in the book of Samuel. While all the king's responsibilities, what he does as a leader, which is basically he prosecutes Israel's wars and leads the people in national defense, that is something that is only Mishnaic and Talmudic. So wondering, why didn't the Torah say, and the king will fight your wars, and why didn't he mention all the things that we had to hear from the prophet Samuel? And this is an indication that the king is not something perhaps ultimately desirable, but is only something that is for certain situations when called for. And indeed, the Netziv also had what to say about that. And there's some nice articles online in both Hebrew and English, we can find them, that elaborate on this idea. But the king is mentioned again in this week's parasha, and that's what I'm going to get to shortly. I was wondering, we study comparative prophets. We compare the books of the Nevi'im to each other. And one of the recurring themes is the difference between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. During the time of the judges, it's interesting, we read about how the Jewish people kept backsliding into periods of idolatry. Last night, when I was describing this idea in Hebrew to some people, they challenged Rabbi Victor Miller's assumption that it was always a small minority of Jews who ever were involved in idol worship. That's how I was taught. But indeed, there are some who say actually it was much more widespread at certain points. Be that as it may, there were times when people were backsliding into idolatry, and then prophets, usually anonymous prophets, by the way, anonymous prophets in the book of Judges came to rebuke the people, and there was a savior, a judge with a capital J, who arose and fought the people's wars and rescued them from the subjugation that God had placed upon them because they had reverted to idolatry. And this cycle repeated itself many times over the course of centuries. Yet, we find that those anonymous prophets never threatened Jewish people with the ultimate punishment, which would be exile. And surprisingly, ultimately, they did suffer Horban, the destruction of their sanctuary. The sanctuary at the time stood in Shiloh, and the way Maimonides and apparently the Mishnah understand it, that was just as temple as the ultimate temple was going to be in Jerusalem. It was 100% the temple, even though they didn't make it a fully permanent structure. They satisfied all the commandments of having a temple by having that sanctuary at Shiloh. And that was ultimately destroyed. There is no explicit warning. Not only that, if you look in the book of Samuel, it never actually says that that is what happened. It's just very strongly implied. And suddenly they reset up a new sanctuary in Nov and then in Givon until they ultimately built the temple in Jerusalem. And it's explicit in other books of the Bible, in Jeremiah and in Tehillim, in the Psalms. That's what it says. And by the way, Shiloh was destroyed during that major battle with the Philistines when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, and in the aftermath of which Eli, the high priest, died of a broken neck, fell from the shock of hearing what had happened. And it's a question. I'll ask this. I'll say it again. Why didn't the prophets mention this? That there would ultimately be a major punishment, a Khurban, and that's what ultimately happened. Why didn't they ever mention exile? Well, I guess because God never actually punished anybody in the times of the judges with exile. But this question is strengthened because we suddenly hear about the king, the first king of the 10 tribes, right after Solomon's death. There was a breakaway. 10 of the tribes followed Jeroboam the first, and he set up rival temples, and his point was to just keep people away from worshiping in Jerusalem. And the prophet told him, because of what you've done, this is going to lead to exile. This is, you've basically opened up the door for all sorts of other sins. You've created alternate places of worship in a matter of a few years that brought about the fact that Jews started worshiping. By Jews, I mean Israelites. They were never called Jews. They're still just called Israelites. They basically began a slow reversion to all the usual idolatry that ultimately led to their exile from the land by way of the Assyrians. So why is it that we read about suddenly one king and something goes wrong and he's basically opened up the door for idolatry? Now they're being threatened with exile. But for centuries, when they were worshiping idols here and there, it was never mentioned. Why is that? And I believe the key is in this week's Parsha, in the only verse that actually mentions the king. Because this week's Parasha, like we like to mention every year, is Ki Thavo. And it is an institution of our sages, one of the oldest institutions of our sages on the books, that this Parasha be read this Sabbath. Even when they used to have a different cycle of the Torah readings, it was a 3-year cycle, for example, they had to read this Parasha this week. And indeed, as the Tosafists point out, our cycle that starts and ends on basically on the last day of Sukkot, on Simchas Torah, it's based on this. This is the week that basically controls all the other parashiot. That, and we have to read the Hukothai right before Shavuot. Those two parashiot basically set up the rest of our Torah reading schedule for the entire year. So we have to read this. And there we have the Tochla, according to one count, 98 different punishments that await us for not keeping the covenant. And only one of them, interestingly enough, describes the fact that the result of which will be that we'll continue worship idols. It mentions exile. Yolech Hashem otecha ve'el malkecha asher takim alecha el goy asher lo yadata tova avesecha. Means God shall lead you and the king that you'll set up or that you will raise above you to a nation that you do not know, you and your forefathers do not know. So here it mentions the king. This is the one punishment where it says, you're going to be taken to exile and your king will go with you. And it also says, and then you're going to worship idols there. It means that you can continue worshiping them, so you're not going to learn from your mistakes. This verse basically connects the institution of the kingship and also the fact that we are responsible for setting up our kings. The one that you're going to set up for yourself. And that's going to lead you to exile, and then you're just going to continue worshiping idols. In the times of the judges, there was no king. There was this concept of Jewish group responsibility, as Rav Schechter points out, arvut, responsibility. We are all co-signers for each other. We all take responsibility. If you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah today, so I can help you do it. That's how it works. We have some community responsibility. And also, Moses had already said that one person can ruin it for everybody else. He leads everybody else into idolatry. But as long as there's no central government enforcing things, there is still an incomplete responsibility. I'm not completely responsible for everything that other people might do. I cannot barge into someone's house and stop them from worshiping idols. I don't have that I don't have that capacity. I'm not the police. I'm not the court. The king has more power to do that. Sometimes it's not a good thing. Sometimes it's better if everybody would just keep themselves on the straight and narrow. But that is the situation. When you have a king, suddenly there's a lot less of an excuse if other people are worshiping idols. And we have this now group responsibility to, for example, build the temple if there's a king. So too, we have a group responsibility to make sure that sins are not publicly practiced. Second, you have a king, now it becomes much worse. And indeed, that's why the first time they had a king, there's just a little bit of it. It wasn't even complete idolatry at the time. His golden calves were also dedicated to the one true God. No, that's it. He already did it. We have a king. Now the full responsibility is here. The full consequences and repercussions of idol worship are there. That's why in the book of Kings, right when we have a king go bad, the people are threatened with exile. But in the time of the judges, there was not this central authority that could have enforced anything. So they could not be threatened with this exilic consequence. And this also harkens back to something we mentioned before. The last king of the 10 tribes was Hosea ben Elah, not the prophet Hosea, but the king Hosea, who was the first of his predecessors to reverse Yerovam's policy. He actually just allowed the Jewish people to go on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And the problem was that when that happened, they did not take advantage. They didn't take advantage of this first opportunity in centuries to go on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, they fault him for that. They say this made it worse. Why? Because now he basically gave them the chance, and when they chose not to, now they really deserve the punishment, and that's what actually led to their capital being destroyed, and most of them being taken away by the Assyrians into captivity and to lands beyond Afghanistan and places like that, and they've never been heard from again, which is quite sad. What happened? What he should have done was ordered his people to begin the pilgrimage once again. He should have told them, you have to go up to Jerusalem. Instead, he just let them do what they did. They were already not used to going. But more than that, his responsibility as a king was they have to organize pilgrimages. That's what they're supposed to do. And this is actually in contrast to Samuel's father, who it says, before, in the generation before the destruction of Shiloh, he was someone who regularly made the pilgrimage, and according to the sages, his root made it so that he would encourage others to do so. That was what that's what a proper person is supposed to do. And instead, they made it harder. The kings made it harder for the people to do the right thing, to worship properly, and actually led them to worship wrongly. And that is what resulted in this punishment. So I mention this now because I am of the belief that had the prophets been around until today, or if there were prophets today and they were writing a similar book about our current leaders, they would describe even the best of them. If we had, let's say, someone who's completely Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Kashrus and got the people to keep the Torah, etc., if he was not encouraging people to go on the pilgrimage and to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, instead he's giving them alternatives, like Yeravam basically did. Yeravam was fully observant and was good, except for this, the fact that he told people don't go up on the Temple Mount to worship. That is the yardstick. They all get failing grades. There's no king of the 10 tribe who's described as doing what was right in God's eyes. Even Yehu, who did a lot of things good and followed God's orders and the prophets, kept to this policy, so he's considered bad. He gets a failing grade. I don't think any modern Israeli leader until today has gotten a passing grade according to this prophetic yardstick. It just has not happened. And I'm awaiting the day. I would hope, maybe we should vote for someone if they could find a proper person who would say that he's a Davidian and he wants to run the country according to an actual Torah system, of which I don't know anybody who's a real expositor. Most people think that the Torah is about forcing people to do things, and it really is not. But if there was someone who actually had his heart and mind in the right place, then I would vote for them. But we still have this problem. We are not at that point yet. We can't do that. And we have to realize that now we're responsible. We set up a government or anything. We have elected officials and they're doing what they're doing. We are responsible for what they did. We're the ones who put them there. Ultimately, we as a klal, as they say, the group responsibility rests upon us. And that's why we have to watch out. And they're saying that there's no real clear winner of these elections. We'll see. It could be that we're just going to have another, waiting another elections in 5 months. Who knows? But it's very strange. Our system is such that the person who is the leader stays the leader until they can replace him with someone. So, this is actually good for the current people in power. They could just keep delaying the inevitable. I don't know. That's what they used to do in the olden days. I haven't seen a correct halachic exposition about what would happen if we needed to replace a king because he was unfit for it. In the olden days, when they needed to replace a king, they usually resorted to regicide. There's no examples other than that. That's how they used to do it, and we don't want to have to do that. And aside from the fact that these gentlemen seem to be permanent and hereditary, means they're king for life, and their replacement is always their son, it gets a little bit difficult. How do we have a system to adjust for this? Short of assassinating him, I haven't seen that. I don't know what the idea would be. Perhaps we could develop our own system where the king would choose to abdicate. But how would you give someone all this power? Most people, once they get power, it's very hard to convince them to give it up. I would also just like to mention that there is a little bit of a chronological thing. This is just strictly technical. We are studying chronology of the times of the judges. It says in the Book of Kings that the temple was built 480 years after the Exodus. They were 40 years in the desert, so the temple must have been built 440 years after Joshua's time. And the Mishnah brings a chronology saying that they were 14 years they set up the tabernacle in Gilgal, right when they crossed the Jordan River. And those 14 years that they were conquering and dividing up the land amongst themselves. And then for 369 years, the tabernacle stood at Shiloh. Another 57 years, it stood in both Nov and Givon. And then it was brought finally to Jerusalem. And the 57 plus 14 plus 369, the 40, that adds up to the 480 years. The problem is that those 57 years include 40 years and change, 40 years of King David's time, plus a little bit of Solomon's, leaving very few years, must be about 13 years, according to the way they calculate this, or 14 years, for the judgeship of Samuel and the reign of Saul. Specifically, the sages give Samuel only 10 years or 11 years, and Saul basically just 2 years, 3 years perhaps, not even. And that's very difficult. There are commentaries, later commentaries, especially those who wrote for example, the Sonsino rabbis and the Judaica press rabbis and other Achronim have dealt with this problem. They basically they dispute this account in the Mishnah, and this isn't such a big deal because perhaps that's just one opinion of the sages. That's the one that's actually explicit in the Talmud, but that doesn't mean there weren't other opinions about how to do this chronology. They don't know how long the temple in Shiloh stood. They just know that there was a time, 57 years of Nov and Givon, 40 years in the desert, and 14 years when they first entered the land. You subtract that for 480, and you get 369 years that the tabernacle stood at Shiloh. I believe that definitely according to the way the Vilna Gaon understands the time of the judges, it was perhaps less time, closer to maybe just 300 years or so. And that would give a lot more time for the reign of Saul, specifically because there's so much that happened during Saul's reign. It's kind of hard to say that he actually only reigned for 2 years, as is explicit in a verse. And there are Achronim, you could check this out in the Das Mikra, who have always suggested that perhaps something's missing from that verse. It's already a verse that cannot be understood according to its plain meaning, because it also says that Saul was a year old when he began to reign. It's obviously true that he was not a 1-year-old. He was actually already a father and perhaps a grandfather when he became king. So it just does not fit. I'm hoping to create a chart that'll explain these opinions, and then we'll be able to talk about this at some other time when the topic comes back up again in hopefully some parasha. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like this, share it, subscribe to the channel, find us on Patreon. Oh yeah, we said like, share with your friends, and send in your questions or comments, and we'll be happy to address them next week. Be well.